I want to start out by saying this tonight. I'm glad that you chose to be with us. I know this is not a usual Sunday night for us. I know this is a bit different from what we would normally do on a Sunday night, but I think this week is going to prove to be good. In the adult class this week, I'll have tonight, and then Andy Irwin out of Fayetteville will have tomorrow night. Milton Stevens will have Tuesday night, and then Brandon Greaves will have Wednesday night. So I'm glad you're here tonight, but I hope you keep coming back with us. One of the things that I think is very important about VBS is not just children's classes, but it's adult classes. You know, every person in this room has something that they can learn, and it was Garland Elkins who said the greatest room in his life was the room for improvement. So if Garland Elkins, the walking Bible, needed to improve, I assure you that we need to study as much as we can. And our assigned topic tonight is to look at Goliath. And I believe as you look at Goliath, you'll find that it's probably an account you've looked at in large detail in your life. You've probably looked at it as you've taught VBS in the past, or maybe as you taught summer Bible school, or maybe you've heard about Goliath in sermons. There's all sorts of different ways you may have heard about Goliath. Usually what we do when we look at Goliath, we look at David. And we try to look at it from the aspect of David and who he was and why he was being sent there and what he was doing and what David did that was so good in concept or comparison to what Goliath was doing and who Goliath was and where Goliath was from. But what I want us to do tonight is I want us to look at Goliath from the standpoint of Goliath. And what we'll do is we'll look at 4 different areas tonight. We'll look at Goliath, who went up against Israel. Of course, you know, as most of you have studied this time and time again, here the Philistines have come up against the people of Israel, God's people. And he steps out and makes that great challenge, just asking for one man to come and stand and fight against him. So first you have Goliath in Israel. Next you have David in Israel. It's very hard to separate David out of the account of David and Goliath, especially tonight looking at Goliath as that bad guy. But what you have is something that's secondary that we may not recognize all the time. David was sent for a purpose. He was sent to gather information. He was sent to deliver that which his father had sent him, and he was sent to bring information back to his father. And yet we're going to learn when David gets to Israel, he sees Israel who was in fear. He sees Israel, the men of Israel, the warriors of Israel, who were afraid of one man. And then you'll see David who faces Israel himself. No one thought he could do it. No one stood on his side, yet everyone just wanted to know why he was there. We're going to make an application in that particular point of sometimes we face our own battles, but sometimes we face ourselves, and David faced Israel. And then, of course, we'll look briefly at the timing of which David faces Goliath. And then as we look tonight in our lesson, we will look at lessons learned. I believe there's a number of lessons that you and I as adults can learn from David and Goliath, especially as we look at Goliath as the central figure of our lesson tonight. So let's begin by studying Goliath versus Israel. And to do that, go with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. I tried to study about Goliath and let my mind go to where some of our children's minds have gone. You look at Goliath, someone who is estimated to be over 9 feet tall. Conservative estimates put him at 9.5 feet tall. And you think about the wonder and the amazement that comes from a child who comes to Vacation Bible School and sees maybe a cutout of Goliath, which is in the hall that they've made this week. And he's standing there at the top of that hall from the very bottom to the very top. Just imagine the size in the eyes of a child. But what I want you to think about as we're thinking about this is the size of a Goliath in the eyes of Israel. Here Goliath comes out, especially as you find him in verse 4. He was the champion out of the camp of the Philistines. He was named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, about 9.5 feet tall. You see verse 5 and verse 6 and verse 7, that which he had with him. In verse 5, he had a helmet of brass. Here's something you need to know about Goliath. Goliath was prepared. Goliath, being a large man, could have been a man who said, I can face any enemy and I don't need to be prepared. But yet Goliath, as you start reading about here in verse 5, he had a helmet of brass. He protected his head. You see Goliath here, he was armed with a coat of maul. He protected the vitals of his body. He protected himself from that which would come from without. We don't often look at Goliath as a smart man, but we do know that Goliath, when he came to battle, he was prepared. You look at verse 6, he prepared his legs. He had a target of brass between his shoulders. Verse 7, he had a staff and a spear that was very large, and his spear had a great weight to it, and he had a man who carried his shield for him. When you think about Goliath, and you think about Goliath coming out to face Israel, why do you think Goliath had such a courage behind him? He comes out, and he only begs for one to face him. He only needs one. Why was he so courageous and coming out and crying, verse 8, to the armies of Israel? Read verse 8. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. I find that's interesting wording from him. Here he is, a very large man, and he's almost taunting them, you come down to me. That's interesting to me. Why did he face this battle with such courage? Because he leaned on his own stature. He was prepared. He was skilled in war, but he had a problem, didn't he? He leaned on himself. Now, I don't know if this has ever happened to you in your life, but for some of us, we can say that this is true. Have you ever faced something that you thought you could do, but you knew you probably couldn't? Maybe there was something in your life that you faced. You thought you could do it, but you weren't prepared for. You stood on your own mind. You stood by yourself. Now, this could be applied in physical areas and spiritual areas. In the physical realm, men, have you ever done this? Have you ever started what we call a home project, working on that honey-do list? And you come to a project that's going to require an amount of a skill that you might not have, but you said, oh, I can do this. And before it was over, you realized that you could not because you stood on your own. You knew you could do it, but you couldn't. You stood by yourself. You didn't go get the help that you needed. And that's Goliath here. He stands by himself. He does not have the help he needs. He believes in his own mind he can face the world. And every man that they send to him, he can face them and defeat them. Happens to us spiritually too. Have you ever said this phrase? I'll never be tempted by that. Well, you probably know that that's akin to a parent, a young parent, or maybe someone who does not have children yet saying, my children will never do that. What usually happens when you say, I'll never do that? It happens, doesn't it? Sometimes we in our lives say that we'll never be tempted by something. This will never be a problem for us. And yet it was, wasn't it? Here Goliath stood on his own, and many times we stand on our own, but here was the problem of Goliath. He stood against God. If you look at verse 9, he continues, he said, if you be able to fight me and kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall you be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And notice verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. It's kind of easy for us in 1 Samuel 17, verses 4 through 11, to look at Goliath and say, Saul, what's your problem? God's on your side. Saul, why are you scared? You know why they were scared? It was a 9.5-foot man. And he was calling for one of them to come fight them, and none of them were 9.5 foot tall. None of them were as big. None of them had weapons as large. None of them had protection as strong. To a degree, we can sympathize with Saul and the armies because they were facing odds that they had never faced before. But I want to bring something to your attention. Does God ever call us to face odds that we've never faced before? I believe the answer to that question is yes. To put that simply, you go to Matthew chapter 28, 18 through 20. Go ye into all the world. You know, for one person to face the entire world, the odds are kind of against you, aren't you? Because that's one person against billions of people. And that's kind of how Saul was looking at this. It's one person against a giant. But see, the reality is it's not one person against a giant, is it? It's not one Christian against the whole world, is it? When God gives us a command, when God gives us a call, it is God and the child of God against whatever is being faced. And that was the problem with Saul. He had a lack of faith in who God was and what God could do. All he could see is the physical. And we're just as bad sometimes. We get trapped in the here and now, and that's all that we can see. It's all that we can imagine. So you have Goliath who comes up to Israel and says, send me one. If we win, you'll be our servants. If you win, we'll be your servants. But don't forget Israel. Proverbially, Israel is shaking at their boots at the cries of Goliath. So you have Goliath versus Israel. But in the second place, you have David versus Israel. This skims us down to verse 20. After some things took place there, and you move down to verse 20, David has risen up early in the morning. I believe that's very characteristic here of verse 20. We need to see this. David had a task to do, and David did not waste any time. Now, I know some of you are like this, and many times I'm like this. Sometimes I'm like this. Isn't it nice sometimes to sleep in on a Saturday morning? Oh, just to get that extra little bit of sleep, to get that extra bit of rest that you've been longing for. You know, it's hard to do that, isn't it, when you have something that you've got to do, when there's something that's pressing. I believe there's a couple of applications that take place from verse 20. Number one, the idea that's behind David and the one who asked him to go check on his brothers. Who sent David to go check on his brothers? Who sent David to bring the food items to go check on his brothers? His father, wasn't it? David had a great respect for his father, and when it was time to do something, David rose up and he got going. I think there's a primary application we can make about this to the Heavenly Father. When there is something that we need to be doing in our Christian lives, or maybe in the ways of reaching others, should we not be like David right here in verse 20 and rise up early in the morning to get the job done? That's David's attitude here. He left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse had commanded him, and he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army and came and saluted his brethren. He's accomplishing the task that was set before him. Remember, go and you check on your brothers. Go and deliver these things. He's going to salute his brethren. Verse 23, he talked with them, and behold, there came up the champion of the Philistines of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the words, or the same words, and David heard them. So here's what's happening. David has rose up early. He arrives at the battle. He's hearing from his brethren inside of Israel. He's hearing about Goliath of Gath, this great Philistine, probably seeing him too. You think he would be pretty easy to pick out of a crowd? Be very easy to pick out Goliath out of a crowd, wouldn't it? You know he saw him. The text doesn't indicate that to us, but I would suggest that he saw him, wouldn't you? Of the sea of men, the 9.5 foot tall man, full of battle array, covered in bronze, he saw him, I think. And he hears the words that this man said. And verse 24 says this, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. What did everybody else in Israel do when they saw Goliath coming? They ran. You ever seen a chicken with its head cut off running? Didn't know what direction to go, but they were getting out of Dodge. That's Israel. Here comes the Goliath of Gath, and they run. They were sore afraid. The word or particular phrase, sore afraid, means a soreness or a afraidness, a fear that runs to the very core of man. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but have you ever been in an automobile accident? That moment before impact is sore afraid. Because you know what's coming, but you're helpless in the feeling to get away from whatever is coming. And here they are. They're sore afraid. All they can see is what's right in front of them. And that caused a great deal of their fear. Verse 25, you move on. The men of Israel said, have you seen this man that's come up? It's almost as they're having a conversation with David. Have you seen him? Well, of course he'd seen him. Who wouldn't have seen him? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spoke with these men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth the Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Do you see David's attitude? Israel is running around scared. David said, who's going to stand up against him? And you notice verse 26, this man who is uncircumcised that defies the armies, and listen to this, of the living God. David had the right attitude. Now we'll talk about that more in our lessons as we go through. So as you follow verse 28, Eliab, his brother, heard when he spake unto the men. So here's his brother, David's brother, and he hears these things, and he interjects in the conversation. Now, I know that you probably know what a younger brother and an older brother do. They know which buttons to push, they know which jab to give, and they know where to give it and when to give it, don't they? Now, if you have a sibling, whether it's a brother or sister, you know those things because probably on your minds right now is the one thing that will drive them craziest the most, because you know how to exploit that. And here comes David's brother, and look at what he starts doing to him. Why comest down here? Why did you come here? David, why are you here? This is war. David, what are you doing? In other words, you're not big enough to be here. Why are you here? He knew what to push. He knew what to do. He said, with whom hast thou left the few sheep in the wilderness? You're nothing but a lowly little shepherd of little bitty tiny amounts of sheep. Can't you hear the brother-on-brother reaction in this? He knew what to do to get under David's skin, and he was doing a good job at it. I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thy heart. Thou hast come down that they might see the battle. You just wanted to see what was going on down here. You ever heard that from your older sibling? Probably, if you are a younger sibling, you've heard that. You just wanted to know what was going on. You don't have any business doing here. Not only is he facing Israel, he's facing his own brethren, and they were against David here. Verse 29, and David said, what have I now done? Is there not a cause? Why are you doing this to me? Is there not a reason that I'm here? See, the older brother couldn't see it, and the older brother didn't know. You know, sometimes we are really quick to react because of the things that we don't know and understand. Has that ever happened to you? You didn't know all the facts. You made a reaction in your life based on not knowing all the facts. Well, that was the brother here. And that's what David was facing, but he had a cause to be here. Verse 30, he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former matter. Well, who's going to beat him? So he turns from his brother and he goes back. Well, who's going to stand up for God? That's the question that's on David's mind. And when these words and the words were heard which David spoke, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent them for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. It's interesting that the words of a young man here, I don't believe David was a child. Some people illustrate him as a child. When he puts on this armor here in just a few minutes, I don't think it was because he was too small to wear the armor. I think it was because he was unskilled in using the armor. Could you imagine having an extra 70 pounds on your person right now? and having to run, having to be agile, having to fight for your life, would you be able to do that? Could you walk to your car with an extra 70 pounds strapped to your back? You'd be unskilled in that extra weight, wouldn't you? And that was David, as we fall out what's happening here. David also recognized, and we'll see this later, the things that David endured and how he recourse this back to Saul in this particular manner. But David goes against Israel. Then finally, what we're looking to get to is Goliath versus David, or David versus Goliath. But the way I like to look at it is, this is not just David versus Goliath. It's not just Goliath versus David. It's God versus the enemy. Because when God's people stand with God, God will always stand with his people. And that's what David had to recognize, and that's what I believe David did recognize. You pick up in verse 40. He took them his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. What's David doing? He's going out to fight the man who's making everybody else run. And he's prepared also. Goliath was prepared. Remember, he had his helmet of brass, he had his armor, he had his maul, he had everything he needed to protect himself. He had his staff and his spear, he had his man who carried his shield. Goliath was prepared, but so was David in 2 different areas. Number one, you've noticed this all the way through. David believed in God. You know the number one way to prepare yourself in this life? Believe in God. David did. All the armies, all the men of Israel, they were weak. They were spiritually weak. Saul should have known better, and we should know better. But not only that, he trusted God in his physical life. He was prepared because he took his stones, he took that which he was good. And what I love about verse 40, his sling was in his hand. What was he going to do? Well, he was not going to have a friendly conversation, was he? That was not the purpose of David going to the battlefield. It was not to negotiate a deal, was it? Well, we'll be your servant, but we'll pay. That's not what was happening. David, the young man who believed in God, who trusted in God, who remembered God. We'll see those things in a moment. He had his sling in his hand with his 5 smooth stones in his bag. I love, as you pick up in verse 40, the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistines looked out and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and a ruddy and of fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. What was Goliath good at? Well, I believe Goliath was good at war. I think we've got to give credit where credit is due here. Goliath was good at war, but Goliath was poor. And listen to the way I'm going to put this. Goliath was poor at choosing a god. He served the gods of the Philistines, and he cursed David by those gods. I'm here to tell you that there's a difference between David and Goliath. David surveyed the evidence and was obedient to the one true Almighty God. Goliath served the evidence and loved his little g gods. But not only that, Goliath disrespected his little g gods. He cursed David with their names. There's a difference in the way you see David and Goliath here in these particular scenes. He knew what David looked like. He said, This is not a man of war. Now look at verse 44. This is where it gets interesting. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. Now listen to this, verse 45. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. The weapons of war, remember. But I come unto thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistine this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all the assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. David goes out to meet Goliath. Goliath laughs at David. Goliath curses at David with his little g gods' names. Goliath stands still on his own. I'll feed you to the fowls of the air. What does David do? His first response, the Lord. What would it look like if you and I faced every battle that we face in this life, whether personal, whether public, whether private, whether it was just a close group of friends? What if we faced our battles? What if we faced our Goliaths with the Lord? Wouldn't it change the way that you lived? One man said that we've got to take the stones of prayer to face the Goliaths in this world. It's a very good illustration of that here. David served with the Lord. Goliath stood on his own. So you see David and you see Goliath. Now, you and I both know, and we know this not only as reading it as an adult, but remembering as a child, David comes up against the man. Verse 49, David puts in his hand in his bag and took a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead and he fell upon his face to the earth. Let me ask you one simple question. Who won this battle today? It was God. David, who comes with the very trust of God, doing something that should have been in the art of war physically impossible, yet it was not impossible, was it? Because David faced Goliath with God. So you have David versus Goliath. You see the difference between standing on your own and standing with God. Now, I believe in this there are some lessons that we need to learn. I believe there are 5 of them, but don't count them and we'll just see how many there are. But there are some lessons that we need to learn out of the account of David and Goliath, and they're going to come from the very text that we find here in the account. Number 1, I want you to go back to verse 32. Go back to verse 32. Now, this is going to be the heart of David. David fought for the Lord. David fought for the Lord. Verse 32, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. This thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Why did David, or why could David go up to Saul, the king of the time, the leader of the army, the one who should have been facing this giant with God, and say, don't let your heart fail. Your servant will do it. Why could David do that? Because David fought for and with the Lord. You know, you and I need to do the same. You and I need to learn to trust the Lord. And we're going to be studying this week, but I'm going to steal this from that lesson. In Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, Jesus in the great temptation against the devil, what did Jesus say over and over and over again? It is written. The greatest way you can begin to fight with the Lord and for the Lord is to know His Word. How did David have such an astounding faith? It's because of the Word of God. David fought for the Lord, and you and I need to fight with the Lord inside of His Word. Now, pause for just a minute. I'm not saying we get in a fist fight for the Lord, but I am telling you that we must stand up for what is right. There's a few areas I want you to see this in. A few areas I want you to see this in before we move forward. We need to fight for the Lord in our homes. I guess having children has changed me in a way that I never thought was possible. But there's something that I see more now than ever. If I don't fight for the Lord in my home as a father, who's going to? And the same is true for your house. You may be a grandparent, a great-grandparent, or a great-great-grandparent in the room. If you're not fighting for the Lord, who's going to in your family? Number 2, you've got to fight for the Lord in your marriage. There's something that I used to think, and you're going to laugh at this, and I do too. I used to think marriage was easy. Boy, wasn't I wrong. Marriage takes work, doesn't it? But I'll tell you what will fail a marriage faster than anything: if we don't fight for the Lord and with the Lord. If we don't take His word and apply it to our marriages, we will fail, because we'll be like Goliath. We'll stand on our own reasoning, we'll stand on our own ways, and we'll never make it. I think there's a third area. Really, there's two more areas you can have, but we're going to combine them in a third point. In all of our other relationships, we must fight with and for the Lord. In your friendships, is this a priority? Because if it's not, their priorities will become yours. We've got to fight for the Lord in all of our relationships. Number two, in the lessons learned, David remembered the Lord. And this is a fantastic lesson. It begins in verse 34. David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Verse 36, thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defiled the armies of the living God. I want to be very careful in this point, because I don't want us to lean toward emotionalism, but I don't want us to lean against emotion. We need to recognize in our lives what the Lord has done for us. And it's illustrated in one passage. Go with me to Romans 3. Go with me to Romans 3. What has God done for you and me? Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. No, it's not a bear. No, it's not a lion. No, it's not an uncircumcised Philistine named Goliath. But it's you and me. Every child of God needs to remember that God is the one that forgave their sins. It's not of our doing that our sins are forgiven. But we need to remember we're the ones who fell short. But because of Jesus Christ and because of His mission to seek and to save that which was lost, Luke 19:10, we can remember what God has done for us. But there are multiple other things God has done, hasn't He? God has given us a second family. That's what the church is, isn't it? A second family. God has given us a home. Not only in this physical life, in the church, but God has given us an eternal home. Has anybody ever just given you a house? I didn't think so. But God has. And we had no way to pay Him back. We had no way to reimburse. We had no way to not be in debt. We need to remember what the Lord has done. David remembered there was this lion, there was this bear, and God was there. Same thing is true in your life. He's given us so much. Number 3, David was prepared for battle. This is verse number 40. And he took, we just read this a moment ago, he took his staff in his hand, chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even a scrib, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. David was prepared. You know, you can always do whatever is at hand if you're prepared. I'll tell you something that's intimate to the heart of preachers. I would hate to stand before an audience unprepared. Because I'll tell you, I don't know what I would do. Yeah, I could read a few verses. I could mumble through something, but I would not be prepared. David, he had a staff, he had his bag, he had his stones, he had his sling in his hand, and he made his way to the battle because he was prepared. He was prepared in his spiritual life. He trusted God. He knew God. He knew that God was not going to allow the armies of the world to defile the armies of Israel. And he walked straight to the Philistine. We need to be prepared as well. Now, this goes along with all the points we're going to make tonight, but the way we get prepared is right here. It's in His Word, and David was a man who was prepared. Not only that, if you go to verse 45, David trusted the Lord. Then said David to the Philistine, pause for just a minute. What would you say to the Philistine? I think as I looked up, my first word would be, wow. I've been 5 foot something all my life. I've never been 9 foot something. Wow. Could you imagine the size of his helmet? Kelly makes fun of me and tells me I have a big head, but you know that man had a big head. He was 9 foot tall. He had to have a big head. We did some things with some children one time. We went doing some zip lining with some children. They didn't have a helmet big enough for my head, and it kind of made me feel bad. That man had a big head. Imagine the size of that. David, he trusts the Lord. You come with me a sword, a spear, a shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord. There's David's trust. Here's ours. You know, we can stand in the day of judgment and not have any fear because God has taken care of you and me. Not only that, verse 45, David spoke of the Lord, but as you move through these things, you see what's taking place with David. It's not just about Goliath. It's not just about what's taking place. It's not just about the army of which he faced. It wasn't about his brother. It wasn't about King Saul who tried to put that armor on him. You know that had to have been a little bit humiliating for David, taking that armor back off. We read about him putting the armor on, don't really read about how he took it off. And yet after all of that, he walks up to 9 foot something and says, I stand with the Lord. Now here's the beauty of tonight. The Lord is not calling us to walk up to a 9 foot giant and fist fight him. But yet he's calling us to take his word, apply it to our hearts. Luke chapter 8:11, remember the parable of the sower? The seed is the word of God. Have you cultivated your heart? Could you walk up to Goliath and say, God has this? Now that's faith, ladies and gentlemen. And through the account of Goliath, we see the faith of a young man named David who said over and over again, who is this man that defiles the armies of the Lord? How about you and me? Will we stand up in opposition to things? Will we do our best to serve the Lord? That's what we've got to do. I really appreciate your attention tonight. You've been very well with me tonight in attention. In just a moment, our children will come back. Matter of fact, at this very moment, the final bell should be ringing, and they should be on their way. And what we're going to do when they come back, we'll extend the invitation in case anyone here needs to respond. We will take care of the Lord's Supper, and then we will conclude with prayer, and then we'll ask you to remain seated so we can do some things with the children. We've got the flags to do with them. We'll see which one's the quietest, and y'all can kind of help me determine who comes in the quietest. So we'll be dismissed for just a moment, and they'll be in here in just a minute. But once again, thank you so much for your attention tonight.